What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Occupy Fantasy Football Podcast, Week 4 XFL DFS edition. We're here again to recap Week 3 XFL DFS usage, player notes, injuries, whatever you need, and then a look ahead to this weekend's Week 4 matchups, player notes, injuries, some IR activations, and then some strategies for FanDuel and DraftKings. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder, your co-host here at Occupy Fantasy, joined as always by Chris Rooney, our XFL DFS writer. What's up, Chris?
Brian, how you doing? It was a close call for me. Had our friend Sammy Coates actually caught some passes on, I think it was Saturday. Might have had a much more special edition of this show coming along for the people, but that's all right. We'll get back at it here in week 4. For those who don't know, I came pretty close in the big GPP. It was in the top 50. I think it was like 44th or something like that. And just with Sammy Coates not doing anything, I knew I was dead to begin with. But super frustrating. But I think we'll get there. We're getting close. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, the new theme of the XFL is if Sammy Coates caught some passes, because that would certainly change some things. I know you did a little Photoshop on Twitter of the new XFL. What would you put? Exactly. What would you put as the new XFL tagline?
I think it was obviously they're going with for the love of football, and I just went with for the love of football. He'll catch one eventually. It wasn't last week, but it was 2 weeks ago. I know he caught a touchdown pass, but he had stepped out of bounds earlier in the route. That's the only great play he's made so far. Obviously, we'll get into that. There's a lot of things to be encouraged about with some underperforming players. Coates kind of on that list, but there are a few other guys, obviously, that we may like even more here.
Yeah, well, let's jump into it then, since you mentioned Sammy Coates, and he's the first guy we had on our list to talk about today from a Week 3 recap. And first 3 weeks, underperforming from an air yards perspective. I mean, the difference between his expected fantasy points and actual fantasy points is through the roof. He's only scored actually 8 points through 3 weeks, which is just incredible. But somewhat concerning, in Week 3, his snaps fell all the way down to 48%. Sam Mobley, his backup, actually got 57% of the snaps in this game in Week 3. So how do we balance this? An underperforming receiver, I mean, just tons of high-value targets downfield. I mean, even in his air yards that we tracked, that Moose tracked, that you can find either on Moose's Twitter feed, you can find in the member dashboard, occupyfantasy.com, with the spreadsheet. That doesn't even include 2 of the long pass interferences that he drew. So how do we handle this with a guy whose snap rate is dropping? For me, I don't think it can drop that much more, right?
No, I mean, this is an offense that loves to, throw the football. I know you tweeted out on the Occupy brand Twitter account the neutral play calling, basically the run-pass split for every offense in the league. Houston is right up there as one of the offenses that wants to pass more than anybody else. That means they're going to have 4 wide receivers on the field, basically more than any other team in the XFL. And I guess unfortunately for us as guys that are chasing Sammy Coates' usage, his usage, as you've outlined here, has decreased dramatically. Snaps going down every single week, routes run going down every single week. He's clearly in that 4th wide receiver hole behind Cam Phillips, who's just been absolutely ridiculous, Nick Hawley, and Khalil Lewis. So, I do think Sammy's usage, I can't say that word today. I do think Sammy's ability to be on the field and make plays is still there. It just may be at a much lower level than we thought it was going to be as we started the season, but eventually regression is going to hit here. And I mean, talk about the other side here. Cam Phillips is just not going to continue to catch 3 touchdowns every single week. I mean, I think we can say he's locked into a pretty firm role here. He's playing more snaps and running more routes than anybody else on the Roughnecks, but this performance is just not worth chasing, I don't think.
I mean, you and I talked about before in our staff chat about Phillips should be priced as the highest DraftKings player, as highest DraftKings receiver. He should be. If you look at his usage, he should be averaging 20 to 22 fantasy points per game, which is really damn good. But he's been scoring 40, 50. So there's a massive difference there, and just 2 opposite ends of the spectrum between him and Sammy Coates. Real quick, are we playing Sammy Coates this week?
I think you have to at his low price tag. 6,100 on DraftKings. I think he's dropped pretty low on FanDuel as well. I don't have that in front of me right now. So, especially as tournament players, which is really all I've been doing here in XFL. I think cash games are a little tougher in this lineup format on both sites. Coates seems to be one of the best opportunities, especially now that he's super affordable.
Yeah. I mean, I can't blame. I'm with you. I'm with you. So we'll be lamenting about Sammy Coates in the Week 5 podcast next week. So be sure to tune in. All right, on to Tampa Bay. A couple situations to talk about here. Nick Truesdale, their first round draft pick, unbelievably as a tight end. He was injured last week, didn't practice all week. He's been seen working on the side early this week. Seems like he won't be able to go. Again, we're recording this Thursday afternoon. We'll see how the practice reports shake out. But again, not a full practice in 2 weeks. Seems unlikely. His backup, DeAndre Goolsby, had a pretty significant role. 64 of 80 snaps, ran 29 routes last week, got a couple targets. So it didn't actually convert, but he's still super cheap and has a role in this offense. In addition to him, they have some quarterback issues. Why don't you talk about all this?
Yeah, so Quentin Flowers has apparently left the Vipers, just gone AWOL, has informed the team he won't be returning. And, I can't say I blame the kid. He probably feels like he's the best quarterback on this roster. He's been forced into a timeshare, playing a part-time role, coming in for, a series of plays or a package here and there with both Aaron Murray in week 1 and Taylor Cornelius for the last couple of weeks. And I guess to his credit, this has been an unprecedented all access pass of like interviews during the game with television coverage, which has been awesome, by the way. I've actually kind of enjoyed that a lot with the XFL product. But Flowers was pretty diplomatic in his answers to questions about his playing time last week. And then, obviously you have this where he's just gone AWOL and said, I'm out of here. So I don't think he plans on returning to the Vipers. Some of these XFL beat reporters have said that, he's a good candidate to potentially be traded, which, may make sense if he still wants to stay in the league and collect a paycheck to play football. That makes sense to me, but just seems like a missed opportunity for the Tampa Bay area, obviously with Flowers as a former standout at the University of South Florida there.
Yep.
And, I do, on some level, kind of feel bad for Taylor Cornelius. I mean, I don't think he played too poorly last week. It just obviously wasn't well enough to get the job done. So, but for those of you who have been kind of all in on the Flowers bandwagon, and I know we had him as running back eligible on FanDuel last week, that's over here. It's going to be Taylor Cornelius' show here in week 4, and Aaron Murray is healthy, but he's going to be serving as their backup here this week.
Did practice, but I think he's still a week away from returning. So, we'll get Cornelius again under center in week 4. Real quick, their backfield. Seems like we can't predict this to save our lives. De'Veon Smith, most snaps in week 1. Jacques Patrick got more snaps in week 2. De'Veon Smith was back to the lead back in week 3. So if we do a little pattern reading here, Jacques Patrick easily the lead running back in week 4, right, Chris?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Even weeks is going to be Patrick Smith. I will say, we don't kind of publish this stuff in our plugs that we put out just because we don't really have the licensing for that. But just looking at some of the pro football focused data, De'Veon Smith has been one of the more elusive backs in the XFL. So, if his workload does stay consistent with last week, his usage, I'm going to keep trying to say that, but I can't.
Crushing it.
His the amount of plays that he is getting in this offense. No, Smith definitely will be interesting if he continues to play more than Patrick, just because it seems like he has the ability to be more explosive out of this backfield here.
Let's go with involvement. How's that word sound? Involvement? Is that a good one?
That's what I'm going to go with from now on. I appreciate that. Yeah. I'm going to bust out the thesaurus here, which apparently I can say that, but anyway.
So actually, looking at play-by-play data, De'Veon Smith, Jacques Patrick both have 6 red zone opportunities this year. Jacques Patrick actually leads the league with 4 goal line opportunities. So again, as we talked about through the first couple of weeks, Tampa Bay just underperforming dramatically in the red zone. They finally got on the positive side there in week 3. So still some value to be had with these Tampa Bay running backs. Okay, moving on. Talking about value with running backs, I think we have the 2 most valuable running backs in Dallas, right? We talked about through 3 weeks how running back scoring was down, an afterthought in both DFS and regular season-long fantasy. But Cameron Artis-Payne, Lance Dunbar combined for 95 snaps last week. There's only 69 total plays, so they both played a decent amount together. They're the leaders in both goal line and red zone opportunities. They're leaders in running back targets. Just incredible involvement for these 2 running backs in this offense.
Yeah, so my kind of quick back of the envelope math on all the great air yards Moose has been doing It looks like Dallas has, just as a team, the second lowest average depth of target on routes, which totally makes sense. I think in these couple of games we've watched Landry Jones play, and then even Philip Nelson in week one, this has just been check down city. It's been a lot of targets for Dunbar in particular, a little more than Cameron Artis-Payne. So I think Dunbar in particular is actually the best value out of this backfield. If he's going to get, 6, 7, 8 handoffs, and if he's going to see, I don't think he'll see 11 targets like he did last week. That was kind of insane. But I guess maybe, I don't know. This is a game against Houston, and this is expected to be the most high-scoring game in the league with a 50.5-point total right now. Two offenses that love to pass. So, I do think Dunbar probably will be one of the most popular running backs on this slate, but for good reason.
Absolutely. Let's talk about their receivers a bit. Donald Parham, we've been touting for weeks, and he just exploded in week 3. He's been leading the team in snaps and route run. And then right behind him, Jeff Badette, who is drastically underperformed, but not from like a usage standpoint. Just he hasn't done anything. Yeah. He hasn't even gotten targets really that much. Josh Crockett, who made a name for himself in week 2 and then got on the field a decent amount in week 3. Flynn Nagel, their slot receiver. And then after that, it's a pretty big drop-off. Our boy Jazz Ferguson not getting a ton of run just yet. But they also just signed Armonte Edwards, former college quarterback at Appalachian State, high draft pick by the Carolina Panthers, receiver. He was in the CFL for a while, so now he's coming over. Do you think he impacts any of these big 3 or 4 guys as far as playing time goes?
It's interesting. He just got there, right? So maybe in week 5 or something like that, we'll see a little more involvement from him. I'm kind of thinking this is a little bit like the Trey McBride experience we had. He was back in week 2 for LA, but wasn't necessarily ready to play a full, role, whatever they envisioned for him. And so maybe Edwards is just kind of getting acclimated to, the Renegade system here, and certainly has the talent and the ability to make some waves here in week 4, but I have a hard time really trusting him over some of those guys you were just highlighting, Badette and Nagel, who have been there, who have been playing a ton and haven't necessarily completely popped off for large games. So, we want to keep an eye on Edwards, but I don't think he's going to be a large factor here in week.
Yeah, someone we won't be recommending this week, but we'll keep an eye on his usage for sure. Let's go up to Seattle. I say it's your boy because I think you've been his number 1 fan since the XFL has started, but for good reason. Keenan Reynolds, former Navy quarterback, spent some time with Baltimore and in the NFL. He is just a number 1 receiver from an involvement standpoint, from a target standpoint. Played all but 1 snap again last week. I think 7 targets again. Again, there's some issues with Seattle's affinity with running the ball and their quarterback situation, but Reynolds, from a usage standpoint, is a legit number 1 receiver in this league.
Yeah, I think from a weighted opportunity perspective, just one of those metrics via air yards kind of calculations that came out of Josh Hermsmeyer's work. He's 3rd highest, I think, on the slate this week, behind Cam Phillips, obviously, and then Trey McBride, if we just look at what he did just last week. He's actually ahead of Nelson Spruce, who won't actually even be playing this week. We'll touch on that in a minute. So Reynolds is clearly the top option in this offense. I know Austin Proehl has had the actual box score results, but everything else shows Reynolds seems to be the guy that they want to use. It's just going to require a little more accuracy and a little better play out of Brandon Silvers, I think, to get him there. But, it doesn't seem like there's any real threat to his ability to get out there and make some plays on this offense other than Silver's accuracy. He has 9 receptions on, I think it's 24 total targets. So,
wow.
I mean, that's obviously got to come back to the mean a little bit here. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, he'll be on our underperforming receiver list for sure this week. Speaking of underperforming, the entire New York offense, the Guardians, Matt McGloin was injured. He has turned into an insect. He is on the injury report with a thorax injury, which I actually asked my doctor friend about that. And he's like, yeah, humans do have thoraxes, but like no one would ever describe anyone as having a thorax injury. So not sure what that's about.
They probably just probably out with case of not being very good, and they got to call it something. This is interesting, right? We got all 3 quarterbacks to get a little bit of action against the Battlehawks for the Guardians last week. Marquise Williams out of Carolina obviously played a fair amount in relief of McGloin, and then at the very end of the game, when the result was pretty much all but determined, they threw Luis Perez in there to see what he could do. And I will say, I don't think we have fully the information on exactly who's going to draw the start here for the Guardians yet. But if this is a Perez game, this is a revenge game for him. He was drafted by the Wildcats. That's who they have coming to town here on Saturday afternoon. So maybe a little extra juice in Perez here, maybe a little more motivation to kind of show up and ball out against the Wildcats if they put him under center.
Yeah, I mean, any sort of competency at quarterback would be helpful for the entire New York offense. Another guy that I just want to touch on really quickly is a guy we actually pinpointed before the season started looking at rosters as a pass-catching running back. And given his history in the receiving game and the lack of involvement between Darius Victor and Tim Cook throughout their history, both in college and NFL preseason and whatnot, Justin Stockton finally got on the field last week and only played 7 snaps but got 5 targets. So Darius Victor hasn't practiced through 2 days this week with an ankle injury. If he's out, Stockton could see, I don't know, a few more snaps, and I think this is how extrapolation works. If he plays 20 snaps, he'll get 15 targets, right, Chris?
Yeah, if you want to kind of use a ratio analysis here and say that makes sense. And I've seen a few people do that. I don't necessarily agree with that type of analysis, but the point stands here. Justin Stockton is a very talented pass catching running back, and if his usage increases there, I got through that one fine.
Nice.
He will be able to probably put up a decent number at min price. So, if we find out Victor's unable to go, I'll definitely be taking a look at him in some tournaments. And I still think that running one running back is probably ideal here, especially on DraftKings on the PPR version of DFS that we have available to us. Have yet to see a 2 running back lineup win the big tournament here on DraftKings. So probably going to just start taking that for what it is and building accordingly on my end.
Yeah, I think that's right. Even on FanDuel, when both Christian Michael and Matt Jones got into the end zone Sunday, and there wasn't a lot of receiver scoring, the winning lineup in the FanDuel Big GP was still a 4 wide receiver lineup, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was as well.
Yeah, so there you go.
I don't have that in front of me, so.
Yeah, but speaking of that St. Louis backfield, last week, I mean, we hit the nail on the head. I don't think we could have predicted that game any better, where they ran the ball just every single time. They got a quick lead, and Jordan Ta'amu had no reason to throw the ball. And as a result, their slot receiver, DeMornay Pearson-L, played just 21 out of 59 snaps in a game where they didn't have to pass the ball at all. Michael and Jones split snaps evenly once again. It's the same situation this week. It looks like huge favorites. Jones limited or not practicing with his knee injury, and it looks like it could be deja vu for the Battlehawks again in Week 4.
Yeah, and the biggest thing last week was at least Jones had the extra day because they played on Sunday afternoon. They're playing on Saturday evening here, and I think that might make a huge difference in Jones' status. So, here on Thursday afternoon, we have not yet seen the injury report, but if Jones isn't able to get at least a limited session in today for St. Louis, it's probably a pretty good indicator that he's not going to play on Saturday.
And we will be all over Michael as a result. But again, just keep following us, and we'll have information in the Daily Plug for you about that situation. All right, final team to talk about. That LA and DC game was insane last week, and it's really difficult to analyze any takeaways from DC's performance given how quickly they were blown out. But on the LA side, a couple of less than 1% owned players in GPPs absolutely went off. Trey McBride only played 16 snaps, but by my count, had about 1 million fantasy points. And then Martez Carter, who Elijah Hood was a surprise late scratch as their running back. And no one really knew who was going to get the start. We felt Larry Rose was the most appropriate. But it was Martez Carter who came in and scored 3 touchdowns, and now he's not practicing. So a lot to dissect here.
Yeah, I think we talked about this earlier in the week, Brian. There were 5 touchdowns in this game, including the late touchdown by DC from players that just basically were not owned in fantasy. So this game almost had like 0 effect on the outcome of the slate other than killing all the DC lineups. The one thing I was reading about, and I think we'll have to dig more into this and we'll get more detailed information into the Daily Plug, but I guess Jarrell Presley did have some kind of shoulder injury, and that's why he actually played a little bit less in this game, in addition to just obviously the fact that the game was not competitive.
Right.
So if Presley's unable to go, I think it does make Nick Brissett a little more interesting just because DC has shown commitment to using a couple of different backs here. It doesn't feel like Donnell Pumphrey is able to play a true 3-down role, or at least it doesn't feel like they want to use it. So we'll definitely monitor that and report back by Friday evening.
Yeah, that seems like a perfect FanDuel two game slate type of play. Backup
Right.
running back, reserve running back. So we'll certainly keep an eye on that as the days move forward. All right, moving on to week 4 spreads and totals. On Saturday's games, we have 2 huge favorites and low totals. St. Louis is a big favorite, and who's it? LA is the big favorite, right?
LA's a 7 touchdown favorite. Battlehawks are a 12-point favorite.
Yeah. And the two of the lowest totals of the weekend. Whereas on Sunday we have Houston and Dallas that we talked about earlier. Their total is 6 points higher than any other game. How are we attacking this from a betting markets perspective for DFS?
Watching kind of what happened when the lines were posted here. Sure, most people aren't as sick as you and I are, so they missed this. But DC opened as a 1-point favorite. For a while there, that actually flipped, and Tampa Bay was a 1-point favorite in some of the early action this week. And then the Flowers news came out, and now it's back to DC favored by 2.5. So, I think there is something to that. I think people felt like Tampa Bay has turned the corner a little bit. Their defense has actually played pretty well through all 3 weeks of XFL action. It was just week 3 was finally the first time they started to show some competence on offense. So, I think the one situation that actually is one that I know that you might be all is this Los Angeles game. I know that they are favored by a touchdown. I know they played very well against a team that everyone thought was kind of the class of the XFL, along with Houston going into week 3 when they obviously blew out DC in a huge surprise fashion. But now we have the Wildcats potentially flying west to east to play in the early window on the East Coast, which I know just from talking to you about NFL for the last year, that's like the perfect situation for you.
Dude, I mean, I don't know if there's a perfect or like a textbook letdown spot in the XFL just yet because it's only been 3 weeks. But like, if there was one, it's this spot, right? Like a big home win against the top team in the league. Now you have to travel across the country to play some shitty team that's barely fielding a quarterback.
Yeah.
And they're huge favorites. Like, this is the ultimate bet on New York game, right? Again, it's the XFL. If Luis Perez is starting, I feel a lot better about this take. But just from a situational perspective, I think that's the most interesting. And from a tournament leverage perspective in DFS, kind of a pro New York game script, I think would be the best bet here.
Yeah, New York still has not yet had a high volume, like offensive performance, if that makes sense. They played less than 50 snaps on offense. The first 2 weeks, it did get a little better against St. Louis, and most of the production was in Luis Perez's final couple of drives that they had. So it does seem like there's a chance here for them to make some noise against the Wildcats, who did not look very good in the first couple of weeks. But Josh Johnson probably changed everything for that team. Is clearly the player that they thought was going to lead them to a successful season here. Struggled a little bit to get going in week 2, and by the end of that game against Dallas, he started to look a little better. And then obviously we all saw what happened last week. So I actually think this is one of the more interesting games of the week, even though people may be overlooking it a little.
Yep, I will be tuned in, of course, and it'll be a great late game hammer for that. Is it the early game or it's the early game, right? On Saturday?
It's the early game on Saturday. So
right.
The Seattle St. Louis game is the second game.
All right, cool. So. Perfect. All right, let's talk about some signings and activations this week. So 3 receivers have been activated, or 2 receivers have been activated from the injured reserve. 1 has been re-signed. The first one to be re-signed is Shantavius Jones, who was actually a super high draft pick for Tampa Bay. And then they cut Deontay Dye, who's been their punt returner. And they also have S.J. Green, the CFL star receiver who was inactive last week. So that shakes up some things in Tampa Bay. New York gets Tanner Gentry back, who was with the Chicago Bears. If you played NFL preseason DFS, you know all about him. And then Seattle gets Ruben Muela, who was with them through training camp, got hurt, missed a few weeks. Now he's back, kind of a deep threat. Chris, thoughts on these guys and their potential impact in week 4?
Well, we've just seen some low-priced, off the wall, under the radar players have some big performances in the XFL so far. Obviously, we spent a little bit of time talking about Martez Carter and Trey McBride and their impact in week 3. Does one of these guys have a performance like that in them for week 4? I don't know, but if you were to pick one, it might be Shantavius, just because we've already seen what he can do a little bit. had some deep shots in week 2 for Tampa Bay on his resume, averaged up the target in the low 20s, which is obviously pretty elite. So all he's got to do is haul in one pass and take it to the house to really make a difference on this slate. So I think I would probably lean towards Shantavius, and I think that gives you a little bit of a late game hammer as the final game on Sunday against DC. So Shantavius is probably where I would be looking, but obviously we'll have better thoughts on Friday.
Yeah, we'll have to monitor practice reports and, of course, monitor inactives as they'll be posted about 5 seconds before the game starts on the official XFL website. So we'll do what we can. All right, injuries to monitor. Massive news came out this week. Nelson Spruce, basically the Michael Thomas of the XFL, is out. I don't know if it's indefinitely, but at least out this week with a knee injury. And then Trey McBride, who we were all over before the season started, missed some time with a thigh injury. As we talked about earlier, came back and blew up in a handful of snaps last week. Mm-hmm. He's limited in practice with a thigh, maybe a head injury. We saw him leave that game early. So at least one big name out for this passing game, potentially 2. And our boy Adonis Jennings, I was actually looking at this because my initial thoughts was Kermit Whitfield, who I've just anecdotally have seen play the slot a few times for LA. I was like, oh, he probably gets the bump here. But Adonis Jennings has been the guy who's seen the second most slot snaps on this team after Spruce.
Yeah, Jennings, and then Jordan Smallwood is the other receiver playing a lot just in general for them. So those are probably the 2 guys to focus on here. But Whitfield on the other wild card is Saeed Block, who obviously was a very athletic prospect in the NFL draft a couple years ago, had 4 targets in week 1 and then has kind of yet to do anything else here. So, Spruce definitely out this week. If he's out for any extended period of time, I think it is kind of Whitfield, Blacknall. Those are the 2 that really probably stand to see the most increase in usage. And now Trey McBride, though, I mean, that's a huge story now. I think he got his bell rung, missed the rest of that game. They were already up huge, so who knows? Maybe they just decided not to risk it with him. Maybe. Have not yet really seen a definitive report on his status for Saturday afternoon, but I would think, especially without Spruce out there, if McBride is active, he's probably going to be the most popular player to pair with Josh Johnson here.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, a couple other guys. Actually, I think we touched on all of these guys. So I'm going to list these guys that we've mentioned at some point in this podcast as having practiced this week. I'm going to list them all, and Chris, if you have any thoughts or anything to add about any of the situations, just let me know. So we talked about Martez Carter, huge game last week. He hasn't practiced yet this week. Elijah Hood is back practicing. Matt McGloin hasn't practiced with his insect injury. Darius Victor still out with an ankle. Matt Jones, knee issue. Jarrell Presley limited with a shoulder. Nick Truesdale limited or out with his knee injury. And then we talked about the Tampa Bay quarterback situation. Any final thoughts or anything to add, or if I missed any guys?
Yeah, I would just want to maybe touch again on Truesdale and this tight end situation with the Vipers. They seem intent on using them in the passing game. Without Truesdale out there, I mean, I know you talked about it a little bit. Goolsby saw a great increase in usage. So if Truesdale is out again, I think we have to consider Goolsby once again as an option, at least in some single game formats, which I think is a nice segue into maybe wrapping this up by talking about the number one thing we like talking about here on Occupy Fantasy, which is the satellite strategy. Brian, I've had a really good run these first few weeks, accumulating some tickets on FanDuel to the opening day rally, which is the March 26th big tournament for Major League Baseball opening day. And my largest successes come playing the single game contests, specifically in the early part of both days. They don't seem to fill on FanDuel that early afternoon game on Saturday or Sunday. And the reason being, if you are a smart human and you fill out your lineups on the desktop site, and you select single game, FanDuel defaults you to their main slate, which is the nightcap on each of those evenings. And that makes sense because they want you to play the 2-game slate. But what it does is it leaves you an opportunity to look at the satellites that are posted for those early afternoon games on Saturday and Sunday. They don't typically fill. You can play for a quarter a lineup, basically. There are single entry contests for $1, and you can win $10 tickets into this GPP. They've actually added some satellites this week for another Major League Baseball tournament on April 6th, the Supreme Squeeze, which is FanDuel's regular, I think it's a $6 tournament that they run at least once a month. So plenty of opportunity there. That's just one example. I'm an MLB player, so that's what I'm focused on. But I know they have some PGA satellites in there as well, and I believe they have some satellites for some future XFL content.
Yeah, oh, I mean, just incredible finds by you. And we were talking about before we started recording this, and in the past we've talked about these derivative slates, which are the smaller subsets of the main slate, whether it's after hours, single game, early only, whatever it may be, and satellites not filling to the maximum. Especially on FanDuel, and you can grab a lot of tickets this way. So good find there with XFL, and as you said, with MLB opening day around the corner, we'll have the daily plug up, we'll have that MLB Occupy model up to help you with those tickets. And like you said, I'm sure you're into the teens, if not 20s or more tickets, and you can definitely get tons, especially with the Supreme Squeeze not until April 6th. So. And it's not just XFL. They're offering this for spring training. They're offering this for, I believe, NHL as well, NBA. So lots of ways to rack up these tickets.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, we have the models for NHL, for NBA. I believe PGA will be coming soon. We obviously have the daily plug for NBA. So, Tommy Garrett and obviously you and Moose, we all talk about satellites for these different sports. It's definitely the greatest way to try and accumulate a ton of entries into these tournaments that allow you to really grow your bankroll exponentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the best way to take chances at life-changing paydays. It really is. Instead of using your own money, use the satellite tickets. Really the best way. So, all right, I think that wraps it up. A pretty nice little episode here. Chris, I got to give you props. Your ability to say the word usage improved dramatically throughout the episode. So, big ups to you for that. And,
yeah, I appreciate that.
And if you like what we did here, definitely give us a subscribe, whether it's in your podcast app or on YouTube, watching the replay. Click subscribe, give us a thumbs up, a like, leave us a review or a comment. We'd appreciate that as well. OccupyFantasy.com is where you can get the daily plug, XFL DFS edition. Runs through the top plays, lineup strategies for both sites, lineup strategies for single game and showdown, team notes, player by player, just everything you can possibly need in one article for the XFL DFS slate. So for Chris, I'm Brian. We appreciate you guys listening. Good luck, and we'll talk to you soon.